It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this capacity development talk on Nowcasting, using big data to track economic activity in Sub-Saharan Africa. I hope by the end you will agree with me, if you don't already, that this is an important and exciting topic. For today's talk, we're joined by Innocent Molalapata, Deputy Director in the Research and Financial Stability Department at the Bank of Botswana, Margarida Martins, Senior Economist in the IMF Statistics Department, and Abdoul Aziz Wane, Director of the IMF Africa Training Institute and of the Regional Technical Assistance Center for Southern Africa. I say important because having a good understanding of what is going on in the economy is central to our ability to help our members. Ministries of finance need to know how much revenue is going to be available to finance critical spending. And central banks that are trying to balance growth and stability concerns need to know whether the economy is in fact growing. You cannot safely drive a car if the windshield is covered in mud. So nowcasting, that is forecasting what is going on now, and near-term forecasting, which is forecasting the next couple of months, have been the bread and butter of IMF work with members for as long as I can remember, which means almost back to the founding of the IMF. Our staff go from ministry to ministry and talk to people across the economy to understand what is going on. It's an exciting topic, though, for three reasons. First, it's especially critical during these pandemic times. As our first speaker will tell us, the pandemic has underscored the need to get a better handle on the state of the economy. Old patterns in the data do not give much guidance during the crisis. Around the fund, notably in Sub-Saharan Africa, where shocks are multifaceted and private sources of forecasts are scarce, needs are great. There's been an explosion of interest in and work on in this area, which has been quickly brought to bear to help our members, both through our own country team's work and, as Abdoul Aziz will talk about, directly through CD. Second, it's also exciting because a lot of new data and techniques can be brought to bear. The need for better nowcasting coincides with an explosion in the availability of information and the ability to process it through machine learning techniques. Our second panelist, Margarida Martins, will tell us about that and about how we and our members can harness these new data and techniques. And the third reason it's exciting is because the IMF has greatly stepped up its delivery of TA and training on these topics in recent months, as all our panelists will explain from different perspectives. In the end, this is about our members and what works for them. So to hear an on-the-ground perspective, we will hear from our third speaker, Innocent Molalapata, about his experience. Without further ado, let me turn to Abdoul.
Thank you very much, Andy. Give me 1 minute so I can share my screen. You can see. I hope it is okay now. Thank you for the introduction again, Andy. Welcome to this capacity development talk, which is happening over the clouds. As I speak to you right now, this virtual talk is generating a lot of data. We know how many people are on the call. We can see from which country people are calling in, and we have information on which device they are using. When you think about it, this talk is no exception. Our interconnected world is producing unprecedented amounts of data. Planes, boats, and trains, and the people and goods they are carrying are connected to the Internet of Things. This means their activities are recorded in real time. The same applies to our routine transactions. There is instant data on how much money we send back home or how much energy we consume to power our houses, as you can see on the slide, and our cars. This vast amount of data is met by amazing parallel advances in statistics, machine learning, and computing capacity, as Andy alluded to. These advances allow the processing of big data within ever shorter time span. In other words, we have at our fingertip the data we need to better measure and understand economic activity. And we also have the means to process them. This should be every policymaker's dream come true. Macroeconomic policy formulation rests, as you know, on good quality data and the capacity to extract from the data knowledge on the position of the economy. Yet, in many countries, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa, we still don't have good answers to even some of the simpler questions. What is the growth rate this quarter? How hard has the pandemic hit the economy? Here, the data problem becomes a policy problem. For instance, sound and timely GDP data is critical for fiscal policymakers when they put together the budget, or for central bankers when they consider interest rate decisions. Without this knowledge, policies can be misguided and hinder growth, stability, employment, in short, hinder the population's living condition. This is especially true during crises such as the COVID-19 pandemic. So, how do we get from big data to answering policymakers' simple questions? Nowcasting is the solution. Nowcasts are forecasts of the here and now. They allow for real-time forecasting of a variable using other series with similar or higher frequency. For example, the current quarter GDP can be nowcast using a combination of daily, weekly, and monthly data. We can then update this nowcast every day as new information becomes available on high-frequency data. In a nutshell, nowcasting helps policymaking. First, it uses non-traditional sources to circumvent data shortages that Andy talked about. And Margarida will further elaborate on this issue. Second, nowcasting applies cutting-edge econometric and machine learning methods that use algorithms to parse mixed frequency data, learn from it, and predict variables such as gross domestic product. Another good news is that the infrastructure to apply nowcasting is cheap. You can see it on the slide. Many of the software handling these models and algorithms are freely available online. ATI and AFRITAC South, the Africa Training Institute and AFRITAC South want to be part of the solution. We want to partner with our members and policymakers to bring this response to all policymakers in the region. And we have started the work to make it happen. The African Department's Nowcasting Network has started by delivering a customized workshop to Botswana. Our colleague, Molalapata from the Central Bank of Botswana will share his take on that partnership with the IMF. Under the leadership of the Institute for Capacity Development, represented here by Andy Berg, his Deputy Director, the Africa Training Institute facilitated the development and delivery of the first course on nowcasting GDP in Sub-Saharan Africa. More than 400 government officials applied to this landmark training. 39 participants were selected from 22 countries. This gives you an idea of the size of the demand on nowcasting in the region. This offers me the opportunity to thank ATI's financial contributors for making this capacity development possible. I'll start with our host government, Mauritius, and our external financial partners, Germany, China, and the European Investment Bank. We are especially grateful to our contributing members, Nigeria, South Africa, Guinea, Malawi, Zimbabwe, and Sierra Leone. They promote the sustainability of our effort and give us the strength to tackle the region's daunting capacity development challenges. As you can see on this slide, the production of data will accelerate to double in the next 4 years. We need to turn this data into knowledge to improve policy making and livelihoods in the region. Our ambition is to help mainstream nowcasting in Sub-Saharan Africa. To achieve this goal, the Africa Training Institute and AFRITAC South, under the leadership of the Institute for Capacity Development and the African Department of the IMF, so the ATI and AFRITAC South developed a three-pronged strategy which envisions basically three things. First, we will develop and deliver regional and customized training, tapping the resources that our headquarters will put at our disposal. Second, we will provide technical assistance to countries using new generation of financial programming models. And third, we will facilitate peer learning workshops and attachment to create a community of practice. We hope that countries that gain the capacity to produce nowcast will share with their peers in neighboring countries. To implement this strategy, AFRITAC South and ATI, under the leadership of the Institute for Capacity Development, will hire resident advisors to coordinate capacity development to work on nowcasting. These experts will be backstopped by the Institute for Capacity Development, as I mentioned earlier, who will provide guidance and leadership for the overall work on nowcasting. With the Data for Decision project, our statistics department, represented here by Margarida, will help countries in the region in the collection of high-frequency indicators needed to produce the nowcasts. I will leave you with two takeaways and also the funny picture. First, harnessing big data and nowcasting in Sub-Saharan Africa is possible and can improve the quality of policies and populations' living conditions. Second, you, as government official, you are only one click away from the nowcasting capacity you need. Please talk to the IMF mission chief or the director of the Regional Capacity Development Center covering your country. We will be delighted at the Africa Training Institute and AFRITAC South to partner with you to mainstream nowcasting in your country and in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you for your kind attention. Back to you, Andy.
Thank you, Abdoul. And thank you for introducing me, by the way. So we have seen where the demand comes from and a bit about what we are doing to satisfy it and how our partners are helping in that effort. Abdoul and his ATI and African Department colleagues have been leaders in recognizing and helping satisfy the need for better nowcasting. For those of you outside of Africa who feel left out, let me assure you that inspired by the work of Abdoul and his team, the fund through ICD is also delivering training and TA and nowcasting and near-term forecasting worldwide as part of our broader practice. I want to seize on one point that Abdoul made, which is that many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa have no official quarterly GDP statistics at all. Because of reporting lags for annual data, this means that if the authorities are in, say, March 2021, they may not have any measure, any official measure of what happened to growth in 2020, the previous year. Imagine how hard it is to run a budget or a monetary policy in those circumstances. None of this works without the gathering, understanding, and processing of the data itself. I would like to turn to Margarida Martins from the Statistics Department to tell us more about this foundational part of the effort. Margarida.
Thank you very much, Andy, for the introduction. I'm sharing a few slides that can help with my points. So, as we know, while most economies in the world compile and disseminate official estimates of annual GDP, the situation is quite different across regions with respect to estimates of quarterly GDP. In fact, in the case of Sub-Saharan Africa, only around 60% of the economies compile some form of quarterly GDP, as you can see in blue in the map. Where quarterly GDP is compiled, it is usually made available only more than 2 months after the reference quarter, as shown in the graph. The IMF Statistics Department, in collaboration with the Regional Capacity Development Centers, provides technical assistance and training to African economies and all over the world in the improvement of not only annual but also quarterly GDP estimates. Although substantial progress was attained in the region in recent years, many economies still face challenges as regards to resources, statistical capacity, and data availability. The high share of informality in many economies is an additional challenge for official estimates. As mentioned by Abdoul, policymakers need timely and accurate data, most urgently during the COVID-19 pandemic. Although quarterly and annual GDP estimates are still very relevant for policymakers, they increasingly require timelier estimates. As we all know, GDP compilation traditionally relies on data sources that are available with some lag. For example, household and business surveys or international trade data and price statistics. But with digitalization and the increasing availability of administrative data, a new range of non-traditional data sources is emerging and can be used for GDP compilation, nowcasting, and also for the development of other indicators, high-frequency economic indicators. With all this, an important question arises. How can economies benefit from technical assistance to take advantage of the new available data? With the support from the Data for Decisions Fund, the IMF is providing technical assistance and training to develop source data and high-frequency indicators useful for timelier, higher-frequency GDP compilation and also nowcasting exercises. Examples include the development of monthly indicators of economic activity, industrial production indices, or production price indices that are consistent with national accounts. But the technical assistance also addresses the use of less traditional data sources. For example, value-added tax records or energy production or production from large corporations that can be helpful in tracking the economic activity. But the IMF Statistics Department is also working to develop methodologies to facilitate the use of non-traditional data sources or big data by IMF member economies. Big data can be used to answer to new questions or produce new indicators, for example, with the use of mobility data to understand the impact of COVID-19 restrictions. But big data can also be used to bridge time lags of official statistics and supporting nowcasting and forecasting exercises, for example, with the use of night lights to nowcast GDP. But big data can also be used as an innovative data source in the production of official estimates, although in this case, some additional challenges are faced. Some examples of big data that can be used to produce economic indicators include satellite data that are useful to track the evolution of crops or industrial production, scanner data and online prices that can be used to compile price indices, credit card data useful to estimate consumption patterns, and flight data that can be used as a proxy for the tourism activity. Another good example is the recent collaboration with Google. With the support from Google, the IMF Statistics Department has been collecting business status information via the Google Places API. These data are then used to develop a set of timely, high-frequency indicators that can help shed light on the impact of COVID-19 in business activity. In a similar way, an algorithm is being developed to map and aggregate Google Trends data to international classifications to track the evolution of selected economic activities as shown in the graph. In addition, the IMF is a development partner for the Development Data Partnership. This partnership between international organizations and companies was created to facilitate the use of third-party data in research and international development. The hope is that through this work, innovative uses of third-party data are found and are helpful for countries to further develop high-frequency indicators useful for policy making. We all know that the COVID-19 pandemic posed important challenges to official statistics and created new data needs. But at the same time, it led to new approaches to meet those needs. For the future, we will continue to explore innovative ways to use the new available data and assist economies in further developing their statistics. Thank you, Andy. Back to you.
Thank you, Margarida. We may sometimes pay too much attention, at least in my neck of the woods, to fancy forecasting models, traditional economic models, almost taking for granted that all of this works on the foundation of timely and usable information. So thank you for this reminder that we shouldn't take this for granted, and also for showing us that this is a very cutting edge exercise to do it right. In the end, the goal is to help support better policy and better outcomes in our member countries. For a sense of how this works, I turn to our third speaker, Innocent Molalapata. Innocent, over to you.
Thank you, Andy. Let me share my presentation. Thank you for the introduction, Andy. I will share the Bank of Botswana's perspective on nowcasting. As already mentioned by Abdoul, in July 2020, the IMF offered to train the Bank of Botswana on new techniques that use high-frequency indicators to produce near-term estimates or nowcasts of GDP. To the Bank of Botswana, this offer came at an opportune time as the bank was already in the process of exploring various techniques to produce short-term GDP forecasts. Nowcasting GDP for Botswana is very critical, mainly because GDP in Botswana is released with a lag of 1 quarter. For example, the GDP for second quarter of this year was released at the end of September. This lag in the release of the GDP data presents a challenge to the policymakers who need the most recent GDP data to make informed decisions. It is a fact that good policy making depends on the availability of good and timely data. The bank and the African Department of the IMF organized a 2-day virtual workshop to train a group of economists in the bank on GDP nowcasting using machine learning. And this was in September 2020. This workshop was successful and produced a reasonable GDP estimate for the second quarter of 2020. In addition to the workshop, 2 of our economists attended the first virtual course on nowcasting GDP, which was organized by the African Training Institute. This is the course that Abdoul referred to. The feedback from the 2 was very positive, as they indicated that the course enhanced the understanding of machine learning and factor models. The Bank of Botswana has since been able to independently produce nowcasts of GDP, which have been consistent with those produced by the IMF team. And through this training, we have been able to produce reliable GDP nowcasts, which feed into our quarterly projection model. As already discussed by Abdoul and Margarida, machine learning uses high-frequency indicators, which are highly correlated with GDP, in order to produce nowcasts of GDP. In our case, we use monthly and quarterly indicators, such as bank loans to households, electricity generation, diamond exports, and GDP for the US, India, and China. It is important to indicate that we keep on revising these indicators as data becomes available. And this is in order to improve the performance of the nowcasting models. This chart shows the GDP nowcast trend. That is, the blue line is what the model had predicted, both in sample and out of sample. And the gray line shows the actual output growth. It is clear from the chart that the model performed relatively well, managing to capture the 2009 global financial crisis and the 2020 COVID-19 induced crisis. As for our recent nowcast, we had predicted a 31% growth in the second quarter of 2021, and the actual growth came out as 36%, which was a good prediction by the model. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Innocent. I can't help from commenting on that last slide and on that prediction. Usually when you see an out-of-sample forecast that is way outside the historical experience, you know you've done something embarrassingly wrong with your projection. So it's really, really impressive to see that it caught that unprecedented increase in GDP. So that's exciting to see. From my perspective, it's also really encouraging to hear that we've been able to help based on essentially one seminar and one training course. This shows how effective capacity development efforts can be when they're timely and relevant, when they're closely coordinated with the activities of our area department, who is the ongoing partner with the country, and when the member is engaged from the beginning and ready to benefit from the information they gain. So we have time for a little time for questions. Let me start with Abdoul. Abdoul, why are we talking about this now, and why the focus on Africa?
Thank you very much, Andy. Good question on why now, since big data and nowcasting methods have been here for some time, and the importance in terms of usage has increased with machine learning techniques and the Internet of Things. However, I must say, until recently, only few countries in Sub-Saharan Africa expressed interest, and the impact of the COVID-19 actually can be seen sort of in surging interest from policymakers in the region on nowcasting methods and harnessing big data to improve the quality of policy making. My take is the crisis has shown the urgency of fine-tuning macroeconomic policy. It has also shown how costly policy mistakes can be because of lack of information or lack of data. For example, you can see that an underestimation of the size of the shock on GDP, or the COVID shock on GDP, would lead to an underestimation of the revenue loss and the financing gap. Obviously, this means that, you sort of impairing your capacity to purchase vaccines, hospital beds, and respirators to protect the population and support sick people. So I think the shock has shown to government officials and policymakers that it is important that the quality of policy be fine-tuned. And we can see it in the demand for the course that was for the first course that was developed thanks to the Institute for Capacity Development. We had more than 400 applications to the course, and while we had only less than 40 slots available. So the demand is also picking up. As a capacity development organization, we're also following, obviously, the demand, and that's the reason why we're picking up our work on nowcasting. I would like just to close by saying also, we are trying to integrate our work with what's happening in terms of surveillance and program discussions, and the country teams in their consultation and discussions with country authorities are more and more using nowcasting techniques, and this is thanks to the African Department nowcasting network. And you can see, actually, if you read the Regional Economic Outlook, the flagship publication of the African Department, you can now see on a routine basis nowcast of the region's GDP in this publication. So I would say sort of it's gaining steam, and also the continent is producing quite a lot of data. You might think that there's no big data, but especially in the financial sector, as someone was mentioning in terms of credit data, you can find a lot of data thanks to the Internet of Things and connectivity of people and fintech that is sort of taking also steam in the region. Thank you, Andy. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Abdoul. So I have a kind of a follow-on question for Margarida. It strikes me that big data and machine learning techniques started, at least, and are mainly advanced country phenomena. So can we really apply them reliably to countries such as those in Sub-Saharan Africa that are so structurally different, when, for example, many people may not be connected to the internet? And it seems especially challenging to think about using them for official statistics as opposed to kind of early indicators, when comparability across time and countries seems critical. What do you think of all that?
Thank you, Andy, for the question. Let me start by saying that official statistics are compiled following a set of international recommendations that ensure the use of best practices and also allow comparability through time and across economies. The use of big data for official statistics poses some challenges to be sure that these requirements are met. And these challenges are not only for more advanced statistical systems, but also for the less advanced statistical systems. The first challenge is data access. That is common to all economies, and we know that there are some international initiatives like the Development Data Partnership that are working to improve the access to these new data sources. But there are also other relevant challenges like data cleaning, organization, ensuring that the data are comparable with and that can be organized according to the international recommendations, and also that has enough coverage of economic activities. These challenges can be more important in less advanced statistical systems that don't have other data sources. But at the IMF, we are working to develop methodologies that can be applied by all countries, not only the more advanced statistical systems, in using these new data sources. And also we provide technical assistance and training to assist countries in further developing their statistics and increasingly use these non-traditional data sources. That's all from my side. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. I mean, I do know that when we look at IMF forecasts or measures of data, the errors, when you look back 2 years after the quarter in question, the errors for low-income countries are much bigger, actually, than the errors for advanced countries, or the uncertainty, probably because of worse official data and because of bigger shocks and maybe smaller economies and so on. So it strikes me that actually these techniques and these approaches are even more important and useful for low-income countries than for advanced countries. So I'm glad to see all this work. Innocent, I have a question for you. I want to pick up on the last point you made, that the nowcasting is important for you and your institution as part of the bigger picture of policymaking. I mentioned at the beginning that nowcasting can help sweep the mud from the windows of the car, so to speak. And knowing where the car is now is a necessary part of getting where you want to go, of course. But having a map and maybe knowing something about how the controls work, what the steering wheel does, is also important for getting where you want to go. So in our own CD work in ICD, we often try to bring these things together by combining the nowcasting and near-term forecasting with medium-term model-based forecasting and analysis. So I'm very curious to hear more about how you bring the nowcasting that you've told us about out of the the sort of statistics department or the research department and into the medium-term policy discussion.
Thank you for the question, Andy. For one to produce a reliable medium-term forecast, the initial condition, which is the now, is very, very important. Therefore, when you do not have the data for the now, it makes it difficult to produce the medium-term forecast that policymakers can rely on. This is where the nowcast is very, very important because it fills the gap and is used as the initial condition for the medium-term projections. So when you have a reliable nowcast, or when you have the reliable initial condition, then you are able to produce reliable medium-term forecasts that policymakers can rely on. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you. Since we're talking about forecasting, and maybe we have time for one more question, I'd like to close by asking you, Innocent, to tell us a bit about what you would say to others of your colleagues thinking about engaging in this work.
Andy, let me end by thanking the IMF for the capacity building. And to answer your question, I highly recommend other central banks to engage in these trainings. These are very, very helpful. As I've indicated, without reliable data for the initial conditions, then it's going to be very difficult for you to produce the medium-term forecast. Therefore, I highly recommend other central banks to engage in these trainings, Andy. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a fascinating discussion. The pandemic has forcefully underscored how much uncertainty we and our members have to deal with, and this topic is certainly not going away. I would like to thank our presenters today, Innocent, Margarida, and Abdoul, as well as our development partners, including the Data for Decisions Thematic Fund and the Development Data Partnership. Please join us again on Thursday for our CD talk on engineering the green transformation, and on Tuesday next week for our CD talk on financing the SDGs. Meanwhile, you can learn more about IMF capacity development by visiting imf.org/capdev. Thank you.